You have your own different counters that say medicine lifelink, but they look like different counters from this person because they look cute or cool or whatever. And all of a sudden you've got all these things. Someone's playing a Saproling token counter deck or whatever, and they've got a board full of
Distraction makers.
Just for a moment, we will speculate on why Magic is the most complex game and why MIT has basically said that no algorithm can solve Magic.
Yeah.
One, there's 30,000 game pieces.
Yeah.
Plus.
That's part of it.
Cards. The other part of it is that is board state. It's that, when you look at a game like chess or Go, it has a static board, right? It's always the same every game. Now Go is a little different because you sort of build a board state as the game goes on, but the means of interaction is always the same, and chess is just board state, right? It's the beginning of the game. Everything's always the same every game.
Yeah.
Where when we look at something like Magic, the board state is constantly changing, constantly different. There's 30,000 different cards that can be in play with all kinds of different combinations at any given time. If we didn't have a constant board state that can be maintained and changed, or we had limitations on that board state, say something like you can only have up to 5 permanents in play,
right?
Besides lands or something, right? That complexity ceiling would be brought down substantially.
Yeah.
But there's no limitation on this. So you can have as infinitely complex board state as possible, something that is highlighted in the Commander format where you have...
We're not talking about Commander today. We're talking about the board state. We're talking about board complexity.
Commander's always on the menu, boys. Anyway, so we can see the sort of exponentially scaling complexity of having more than 2 players playing the game of Magic.
Because you're taking the most complex game in the world and adding 2 more people.
Multiplying it, yeah.
Hi, everybody. Before we move forward in the video, if you like all of our content, if you like our talks, and you want to support us, feel free to like, subscribe, or comment and yell at us and tell us that we're wrong. The way we want to chunk this video is want to talk about the positives of having a more complex board state. I want to talk about the negatives of a more complex board state, and then just discuss some general design lessons that we think...
Takeaways.
Takeaways, yes. In particular from Magic, but also generally TCGs, because TCGs have a unique board state to them that other games do not have.
Right. So, when we're thinking about positives of a growing board state and of just having a board state in general. Like, you could make a game where there isn't really any board state, right? You have cards in your hand, you sort of play those cards down, and then they go away at the end of the turn or whatever, right?
Right.
You could even look at poker as kind of a game that doesn't really have much of a board state, right? There's basically just the cards in the middle of the table, and then that's sort of the board state of poker, and then once the round's over, it's gone.
Right.
But it's not the end of the game, right? Where Magic has a continually growing board state throughout the entirety of the game, theoretically. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's things that affect it, like, Wrath of God or whatever, but we're talking about
even then,
in general.
Like, you have lands that usually persist, so even through board wipes, there's still a general sense of progression that, like, ends in some big, usually ends in some sort of a big explosion, or as someone ends up beating the other people or whatever. You only get that with Magic actually having like technically a linear progression.
Sure. Right. Well,
technically
linear. Part of the brilliance of the mana system is that it's not entirely linear, but yes, you theoretically only work in the positive and not necessarily in the negative.
But that'll be a video on deck complexity.
Oh boy. Yeah. Okay, so a concept in user experience design is that if you if a user can't see something, it doesn't exist. So you would see this reflected in a website or piece of software as basically like you don't want to nest things into menus that are hard to navigate, because then if somebody like wants to do something and can't see how to do it, then they're not going to be able to find it. So when we look at a persistent board state, this is something that a persistent board state handles well, is that when there's an effect or when there's a game piece that can affect all players that like basically if there's something your opponent needs to know about, it's on the board in front of them. They can see it.
Yeah.
For the most part. But like that idea and that progression throughout the game is a reason why a persistent board state is positive.
Magic and other trading card games get, as far as their development of a board state that is unique to this particular genre of game, is that in most board games, especially if you've if you've ever sat down and set up a complex board game, the classic meme of, it taking an hour to set up and then, you play for 30 minutes or whatever. If you've ever played Scythe is a good example. Let's
not call anybody out directly.
Okay, so Twilight Imperium. Now, if you've ever played a larger board game with a lot of setup and a lot of moving pieces, a lot of the times because that board games comes with this board state with all of these pieces to it right off the bat, it's a lot to take in initially, and it's a lot of decisions to have to consider. Now, usually games are still good about chunking exactly what can be done at any given time during a game. But what Magic does is it ends up, because it has the deck construction as a separate sort of phase to the larger game, when the game starts, you're able to start with basically nothing on the board, and you're slowly revealing things over time and reacting to what your opponent is doing, which sort of creates this tutorialization of the game. It's funny because I've heard some players actually complain about like the first 2 to 3, probably first 2 turns of Magic, because a lot of it is just like, all right, I play my land and I pass turn, or I play my land and pass turn, and then that happens for 2 turns and then you move on or whatever. I think those first 2 turns are really important because, one, you could still play things on your first 2 turns, even if it's not that common, depending on your deck that you're playing.
Right.
But it's about this slow realization of what's happening. Like, I love that Magic turn 1, even if your opponent doesn't play something, you learn what color is in their deck. And then on turn 2, you might learn what if there's a second color in their deck. And like that's already like breaking down tons of information. Yeah. Whereas previously it's like it could be any one of the 5 colors. And then suddenly they play black and you're like, okay, I'm looking for kill spells. I'm looking for all these very specific things that this color can do.
Right. And this sort of segues into a good it's a good transition into talking about information management.
Yeah.
Is that a persistent board state is very valuable for information management in terms of exactly what you're talking about. If I have something that I have to kind of commit to a persistent board, it's giving you information about the other things I might have later that I might be committing to the board. And this is something we see in like really high level play. Like I've been watching quite a bit of like Legacy. People play Legacy on Magic Online recently. And one thing that will happen often is that if someone is playing a very fast strategy and they basically are beating you before you're giving them any information about what your deck is, so that when you go to sideboarding for the next match, do I explain what a sideboard is? Are we in that territory?
Yeah, probably.
Okay, so for people who do not play Magic at tournaments, the way that Magic is played in a tournament setting is that you're playing best 2 out of 3. The first game, you have a 60 card deck and you have a 15 card sideboard. And in the first game, you're playing your 15 card deck or your 60 card deck unmodified. When you go into the second game, you're given an amount of time to switch out some of the cards in your deck for some of the cards that are in your sideboard.
Yeah.
And you're going to change your deck in a way that you think is going to be better at beating your opponent. But if your opponent concedes early on, like let's say you beat your opponent super fast, like your turn 1, you just win. Mm-hmm. You're getting 0 information about whatever deck your opponent is playing. And they're getting a lot of information about what you're playing because you sort of had to reveal that information. And the thing that you're bringing up about land specifically and having it be sort of a persistent thing on the board is that, okay, well, this is now, I'm able to glean things about my opponent's deck based on that becoming known information.
Yeah.
But even one step deeper in terms of persistent board state, something that I've been utilizing recently in the game that I'm working on is a means of understanding how much interaction your opponent has, right? So your mana, not only is it the color is telling you information about what might come later, the amount of mana that's utilized on their turn versus open for your turn gives you information about what your opponent might be able to do.
Yeah.
And without a persistent board state, you wouldn't have that information.
Yeah. And I think that looking at possibility space in any way of chunking down another player's understanding of someone's possibility space is really good. You don't want to chunk it down to be super limited where it's like, okay, I know this person can only do one thing. Right? Like, sometimes that's can be interesting. But most of the time, it's like you have to back a player into that corner, right? And then it feels good of like, okay, I made it so that I know they can only do this one thing, and I can react around that. You don't want to make it too obvious what someone can do. And I think this is funny because we're talking about how Magic is... MIT had the article talking about Magic being
infinitely complex.
Super complex, which is true. We're actually talking about how it is very complex, but somehow does this really great job of chunking down all of these things and delivering these little bites of complexity that grow sort of larger and larger and larger over the course of the game. And I think that's the only way it can manage it. And using the board game example, or like chess, for example, right? Like you have all the information in front of you when you start a game of chess, having all the different pieces right there. And so it's basically the equivalent of let's start a Magic game, but our hands are completely exposed. So you see all the cards that we could play, and we're 7 mana in, and you're like, start. And you're like, what? Okay. I guess.
I mean, chess has sort of a similar like movement towards complexity because you have to move certain pieces first.
Right, that's true.
But yeah, exactly. Like it definitely starts much further ahead than where Magic starts.
And I think what's cool about Magic's board state is not only that it can like start small to help chunk that information and then grow complexity over time, but the amounts of different types of interactions you can get because of this sort of wider, infinitely scalable board space is great. Like you see all these wild interactions online, and I think a lot of that is because Magic doesn't have limitations on like you can have as much mana as you want, you can have as many creatures as you want. I think it's bit them in the ass many, many times, I'm sure, but I think at the same time it can create these like crazy wild moments.
Yeah, and one way that Magic sort of manages some of this complexity outside of board state is card formats. Formats give you a way to chunk the unknown information of what your opponent might be able to do, right? Yeah. So depending upon what environment you're playing in, there's only so many cards that can cost 3 mana, with 2 of it being blue or something. So one of the sort of negatives here is that when cards are designed, I think that you kind of get a particular amount of complexity budget. And this is something I think that Richard Garfield has even mentioned. Yeah. Is that any one individual card can only be so complex.
We said any one game can have like a complexity budget. And I think he basically spent it like for Magic, right? Like
right.
That
like
was
at the
where
beginning.
It was designed. I think he wanted some room to grow, but the game over time kind of got out of that. I think, and he was referencing specifically Planeswalkers when talking about the complexity budget,
which is interesting, right? So let's talk about the sort of complexity of a Planeswalker for a moment. In that, when we look at their sort of closest relative, which is probably an enchantment. Yeah, an enchantment basically has one effect, and it's usually a global effect. Sometimes it has like an activation, but a Planeswalker has can have a global effect. It has 3 different or 4 different activations. It has loyalty. It can be attacked like a player can. And you know, we started talking about this earlier a little bit, and I think what ends up happening is the further down, like if you're envisioning your complexity or your decision making as a tree, right? You have a decision tree, and you have a trunk, and you have larger branches that come off that trunk, and then branches that are coming off of those branches. When you add a branch closer to the trunk, like a whole new card type, there are cascading branches that come off of that new branch that's attached directly to the trunk. Yeah. And so
for both players.
Yeah. And so when we look at Planeswalkers, the level of complexity that comes in because of this new card type, I think might be more than any other card type, right? Because
even
of
it's more than battles.
The sort of branches of interaction, you know, like They have abilities that target. They have abilities that are static. They have loyalty that's now needing to be managed. They can be attacked. Like there's all these vectors of interaction with them, which is good in terms of design space, but complexity wise, they're pretty high up there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when you're thinking about new cards that are being added to the game, I think that you should think in terms of a complexity budget, right? And that there are certain types of effects that add to that sort of complexity, and I think upkeep is even part of that budget too, right? Because you're thinking about, okay, well, how much information can I really ask a player to be holding in their head at any given moment?
Yeah,
you should be thinking about what you're asking your players to do. Because they will do it, right? If you give somebody the opportunity to have like the most immense complex interaction possible, there are players that will play that.
We talk about how sometimes there's cards that are designed in a way that it feels like you're almost daring the player of like, do something with this. Like this is an interesting thing, or this is something we think would be fun. Like play around with that.
And I think that kind of thing is good, right? In that you're sort of posing a challenge to players, where when I'm just going to bring up the card so that we can talk about it.
The card,
because this is, I don't know, it's interesting.
I do wonder if other people are going to be as upset at this card as we were.
I don't know if I'm upset. I guess it's upset.
I was screaming.
So the card that I'm referring to is Nadu. Winged Wisdom, I guess, from a new card spoiled for Modern Horizons 3. This, I think, is a pretty good example of when you're sort of asking players to do something, they will do it, right? And the scaling complexity of this card is massive in that it gives all of your creatures an ability that when they're targeted has an effect, and then on top of that, it can trigger twice per turn per creature. So it's really interesting because they've started to do this thing where it's like this ability triggers once per turn, or now twice per turn. That's new, as far as I can tell. And the issue is that you're adding another thing that needs to be tracked. When it's something that can just happen an infinite number of times, that has its own problems, but it doesn't have this sort of upkeep problem of now players need to sort of invent a way to track this.
Right. And we've talked about how this card, it wouldn't actually be as much of a problem. It'd still be a problem, but it wouldn't be as much of a problem if this card were just an enchantment. Or especially if it were just like an enchantment aura that just like attached onto one creature and did this. Right?
No,
because that's something it's clearly trackable because it's attached to the card. You see that card has a different thing associated with it, but it's it's already hard to track if there's a card that says other creatures get +1/+1. Like, it doesn't seem like that would be hard to track, but suddenly when you have 10 creatures and you're counting up damage for the turn and you're counting halfway and then you go, oh wait, this guy actually gives all of them +1.
Right.
It becomes much harder to track.
Right.
This is that times like 10.
Right, because like per turn, you not only need to track which creature has been targeted, you also need to track how many times it's happened, and you need to resolve the effects. And I think what's interesting is this card is a creature because of Commander, right? It's a legendary creature so that it can be in the command zone, so that it's an effect that you have easy access to. And so like if it was an enchantment, it has to go in the 99. So like you're only going to see it so often, and it's going to be harder to build around this type of effect.
Do you think they did that, or do you think they made it as a legendary because they really liked the effect but knew that there couldn't be two of them?
That's also wild.
Yeah.
If you had two of these,
right,
it gets
must,
even. You know what?
It must stack, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you'd have two instances of this
So
thing.
every time that happens, you would draw two cards.
So you could use certain clone effects to clone this, by the way. And then,
I know. I play a legendary clone
like
deck, so Helm of the Host.
No, what's the...
It's the blue enchantment?
Sakashima is the clone.
Yeah.
So, that sounds wild.
Yeah, but what I'm wondering is, like, it would trigger both of the things at the same time.
Right.
So it still only activates twice, but it's activating both of them.
Well, no, it could happen technically up to 4 times, but it would be triggering them 2 at a time.
Right, yeah.
Whee!
Sure.
So
I think what... we probably sound like grumps when we talk about this, because I think that it's tough because we're always coming at things from a design perspective. I don't know if this is going to stay in the video, but we're always coming at things from a design perspective. And so I feel like a lot of the times we'll end up getting some conflicting comments where there's a lot of people that I think understand where we're coming from. And there's other people that like play Magic their whole lives and are like, what are you complaining about? You guys explained it. Like, clearly you understand and can do that. And it's like, well, yeah, like we get it. And like, maybe we'll do that. But like a reason that I think that this is too complex of a card, for instance, to track, is one, to further your point that you made in the beginning of the video, that like the UX principle of if you can't see it, then you won't know that it exists.
And the part here that I think is the thing to key in on is something that you can't really see.
Yeah.
Is like how many times this is actually triggered. I think that's really the problem.
Yeah.
Is that like we have lots of effects that are granted to a bunch of permanents, and then now all of those permanents have that effect. Yeah. But the part that's going to be like there's no like built-in mechanism for tracking whether or not something's happened twice already.
Right.
It's I don't know.
And now to add on to that is like I was just watching a video from MTG Goldfish earlier today, and it was showing like the top 10 top 10 biggest mistakes or something like that, and Pro Tour biggest missteps, mishaps, whatever it was. I feel like half of them were missed triggers of something. Like some player missed this thing or didn't get that interaction right in this way. And so any sort of opportunity to not only add a trigger that could potentially be missed, but now it's a trigger that has a certain amount of limitations, and it's attached to something else that has its own thing that it does, which is a creature, is like adding so many different variables that like it just it's very complex. There's a lot of stuff going on. Magic already, at its core, with vanilla creatures and a couple sorceries,
already complex.
Very complex game.
With the way that they've sort of designed this card, it's going to end up introducing a level of cruft to the game, right? In that these targets, these triggers once or twice per turn, are going to have to be tracked somehow. And that it's going to be represented with a die or an additional token, or who knows? Players are going to have to invent some way to track it.
Right.
And so, you're going to introduce a level of cruft. Cruft meaning additional sort of clunky components that are added to a game.
Right. When there gets to be a certain level of cruft, which already, we talk about it in our cruft video, but yeah, it just adds even more complexity, because now all of a sudden you have all these different markers and you're looking across the table and you're seeing like, well, you've got dice over there. You've got little counters that say menace and lifelink. You have your own different counters that say menace and lifelink, but they look like different counters from this person because they look cute or cool or whatever. And all of a sudden you've got all these things. Someone's playing a Saproling token counter deck or whatever, and they've got a board full of
what's going to end up happening is, like, at the beginning of your turn, your opponent is going to target, one of your opponents is going to target one of your creatures, and it's going to trigger. And then it's going to happen again in the middle of your turn. The same creature gets targeted. Okay. And then you're going to get to the end of your turn, and because so much other complexity has happened during that time, you're going to forget that one of those triggers happened.
Right.
Unless you have some way to track it. Let's talk about some design implications here of comparing and contrasting the way that Magic handles board state versus how other games might handle board state, and things that we can learn from what Magic's done.
Right. And I think Magic having this sort of unraveling board state that chunks its information slowly. Oh.
Cat hair on your mug.
Thank you.
Okay, start over.
Magic sort of having its unraveling board state that chunks information and slowly reveals it over time, while also allowing like a variety, because you have a deck of cards. You're probably not going to get through your whole deck every single game. It means that every game is going to be a little bit different. And then in tandem with whatever your opponent is playing is going to create an even more different board state. Just creates a lot of variance and makes a lot of interesting interactions. And I think it's partially why the gameplay loop of, you progressing in this duel that escalates to this major point, duel ends, and then you can restart and have this completely different sort of like play state that you build up and a different outcome, is what keeps people coming back more and more.
Yeah, and I think like when we compare Magic in its setup to other games, right? Deck building does consume a lot of time, but it happens away from the table, right? So when you get to the table, you're ready to go. All you need to do is shuffle your deck and start playing your cards.
Yeah.
And you're going to build that board state as the game goes on, like you said, right? It's this sort of story that unfolds, this escalating progression over the course of the game. And there are other games that do this too, one being Betrayal at House on the Hill. I always get it. I always like miss a word.
It's Betrayal at the House on Haunted Hill.
Haunted Hill House.
Oh, Betrayal. I'm trying to read it from my board game.
Oh, perfect. Yeah.
Betrayal at a House on the Hill.
That's it? I thought Haunted was in there somewhere.
I don't see Haunted, but it could be written really tiny.
So Betrayal,
Yeah.
That's another game that has an unfolding board state over time, and it tells a very interesting story as you're sort of exploring the house, right?
Yeah.
And lots of different things can happen with the variants. And so, I think some of the best things here that we can learn from Magic is its ability to build a board, with its ability to build a board state over time, is that it chunks complexity for players. It gives you lots of levers of interaction, and ultimately makes the game different each time as the game unfolds.
And I think what's important, I think it's something you and I care about a lot with games, is that when you have any sort of varying levels of variance, I guess, or multi-layered levels of variance.
Yeah.
With any sort of a reveal or a slow build-up, you're going to get like a very different story every single time that you play.
Yeah.
You might have a similar strategy with your deck that you're playing, but how your strategy or how your tactics end up playing out in your actual game is going to be that much different. Is going to be much different than your previous games.